You are listening to This Election, where we are committed to the inner work that is needed to do politics differently. This is episode number 8. I'm your host, Katie Cochran, and I'm so glad you're here. This podcast series offers a new way of looking at politics, one that focuses on how we engage with others rather than on our partisan identities or policy preferences. It explores why politics is so triggering and offers spiritual practices that heal past wounds, ground us in our bodies, and connect us to that which transcends our differences. If you are committed to active citizenship but feel worn down by a political culture of fear and anger, this podcast is for you. If you have lost sleep over politics, or your temper, or a friend, this podcast is for you. Politics is hard, but it's something we can heal from, and it's something we can change. It won't be easy. It'll take practice. But my hope is that the conversations here open us up individually and collectively to a new way of engaging. This election, we will do politics differently. Our guest today is Emily P Freeman. She is the New York Times bestselling author of 6 books, including The Next Right Thing, a simple, soulful practice for making life decisions, and How to Walk into a Room, the art of knowing when to stay and when to walk away. With a master's degree in spiritual formation and leadership from Friends University, her most important work is to help create soul space and offer spiritual companionship and discernment for anyone struggling with decision fatigue. Emily has been a featured speaker at Renovare, Anglican Mission in the Americas, Faith and Culture Writers Conference, and The Apprentice Gathering. Her writing has been featured in Today, Parents, Christianity Today, and Pethios. Her nationally ranked podcast, The Next Right Thing, has more than 26 million downloads, and she regularly offers perspective and clarity through her weekly newsletter, The Soul Minimalist. Emily's words have accompanied me through so many life decisions. She was there when I left geopolitical forecasting to take a position at the shelter. She was there as I grappled with the challenges of keeping the shelter open during the pandemic, accompanying me through both the administrative hurdles and the spiritual challenges that came with witnessing the trauma that ran through so many people's lives. Again and again, she helped me find wisdom. Wisdom within my faith tradition, wisdom within my own experience, and wisdom in the silence, because sometimes wisdom comes without words. Her newest book, How to Walk into a Room, found me as I grappled with decisions about vocation, family, and citizenship. I read it first through the lens of vocation as I grappled with the desire to work at the intersection of trauma and grace. Then I read it through the lens of parenting as I entered the room of middle school parent, eye rolls and all. Today, we will talk about it in the context of citizenship, about how we evaluate the political spaces we inhabit, and what to do when we no longer feel comfortable in those spaces. Reading through this lens helped me to understand the journey I've been on as citizen these past 8 years, but also helped me clarify how I want to inhabit political spaces. On this podcast, we talk about politics as the way we engage with others. Her book challenged me to think about how I want to show up as a person and as a citizen when I engage with others on political issues. I am so excited to be able to talk with her today about her new book and about the spiritual practice of discernment more broadly. It is a practice we need if we're going to do politics differently. Emily, thank you for joining me.
What a joy it is to be here with you, Katie. I love what you're doing, and I'm just thrilled for this conversation.
One of the goals of the podcast is to redefine politics, to not only be about our partisanship or our policy preferences, but about how we choose to engage with others. And so I like to start all of my conversations with a question about an early political memory and what it taught you about how we engage.
Well, one of my earliest political memories reaches back into the far world of the 1980s. It was 1988. I was 11 or 12 years old, and we lived in Iowa during the 1988 presidential race. I remember one of the candidates was a man named Michael Dukakis, and we were in Iowa, so the Iowa caucuses was somewhat of a big deal, still is, but I didn't understand what any of it meant. And the reason I remember Dukakis is just because he showed up at a local mall where I lived in Iowa, and I remember I couldn't see him because I was too short, but then I think he was actually fairly short as well. But it's these little core memories that stick in your mind, right? But the reason I bring that up is because I thought, because his last name was Dukakis and it was the Iowa caucuses, I thought the caucuses was just like meetings for him, like gatherings of people for that particular candidate. And I remember thinking, like, what about the other guy? I think it was Bush he was running against. I remember thinking, like, does he have bushes? There's the caucuses, and then maybe there's like the bush. It was just like complete confusion, right?
Yes.
But that's one of my earliest memories, which maybe is indicative to many long years of knowing that there was a political landscape, but not really fully understanding. It wasn't really something that my family talked about actively, maybe a passing comment or two. But it wasn't really until, I don't even know if when I was old enough to vote, if that was a big deal at that time, but maybe it was in college or right after college that I started to become a little bit more aware that, oh, I actually have a voice and I can be a part of this conversation.
I love that. I think it's a good analogy too for a lot of us, right? Politics can feel like this thing that is going on around us that we like kind of understand and we're making assumptions about or trying to figure out, but it's a lot more complex and we can play a much bigger role than we think, right? So if one of the pillars of the podcast is politics, the other two pillars are trauma and spirituality. So trauma, because we really need to understand how politics has wounded us, and then spirituality and spiritual practices so that we can understand and move through that woundedness to be active, intentional citizens. You have done so much work on spiritual practices. So before we jump into discernment, can you share a little bit about your understanding of what a spiritual practice is and why we need them, especially when we've been wounded?
Well, I would love to. Even before practice, I like to talk about formation. And Dallas Willard is a philosopher, a writer, a huge influential voice in the spiritual formation world. And he talks about, and said this often, that we are always, all of us, getting a spiritual formation in the same way we're getting an education. The question is not whether or not we are getting one. The question is what kind. And so the point or the goal of spiritual practices is to participate in our own becoming, in our own formation, and to do it on purpose. The point is never the practice itself. And I think sometimes in certain Christian circles or just circles in general, the way we talk about practice, sometimes we can miss that the goal is union, is love, it's connection. It's not the practice itself. I also appreciate Michael J. Cusick, who says the work of spiritual formation is to tend the gap between what we believe and what we experience. And so that idea of tending that gap is where spiritual practice lives. A large work in spiritual formation comes from Richard Foster in The Celebration of Disciplines, which was written or published way back in the late 70s. But he says that the practices are a series of concrete actions that will gently move us to transformation in Christ. Sometimes it's the people who know the most who are able to simplify things. It's easier to say more words. It's harder to say less words. And I think if Richard Foster says it that way, then I'm on board. But this idea of tending the gap, I think it was Cusick who said it's almost always about learning to metabolize love. That's the work. And so when you talk about trauma and practice and how those things sometimes don't go well together, I think any practice that helps us to metabolize love, the love of God, the love we can have for one another, that's a good practice. But if there are practices that are causing us to feel any hints of shame or legalism or shoulds, those may be practices we need to gently lay down for a time, because really the practices are neutral. It's what they stir up within us, and different seasons might bring different stirrings, and that's really important to pay attention to.
Yeah. I love that. Just knowing that the practice is not an end in and of itself, but also how to evaluate them as your life changes. Because like you said, for the season that you're in, you may need different things to help you mind that gap. Today, we are going to be talking about the spiritual practice of discernment, which politics requires a lot of, right? We have to decide whether we're going to vote, who we're going to vote for, what policies we're going to support, how we're going to engage, if we're going to bring up different topics to different people. There's like all of these decisions around politics, but we don't often think about discernment in that realm. And so I'd, again, just love you to talk about what discernment is and what the practice of discernment is and how it can help us make these decisions.
Discernment is something that I love to talk about. It's deeply mysterious in some ways because once you start going down the little cavern of what discernment is, I feel like I continue to learn more and more. And it's differentiated from decision making. I think they go hand in hand, but a decision is often what we come to after a process of discernment. A decision is what we want, right? It's, I have a question, I don't know what to do, what's my decision? And it's easy to skip over the slower, more formative, more sometimes frustrating process of discernment, partially because it's not efficient. It often requires community, and sometimes we don't feel like we're very good at it. There are those who probably are more naturally maybe gifted at discernment. Maybe they have that sixth sense or that kind of inner knowing that comes naturally. But discernment is both gift and practice. And so it's not just, I don't have that gift, so therefore that's not something. Unfortunately, we don't get to bypass it. It's something that's part of all of our lives, and we can hone and learn how to become better or more wise discerners. It's just like those who are more gifted at teaching or painting. A keen sense of discernment might be a way that you naturally see, a way that you relate to the world. But I also think it's something that we all can learn, and I would submit ought to learn to cultivate, hone, and sharpen. Discernment is less about what's exactly right and what's exactly wrong. I think when you enter into conversations about discernment, you're entering into that gray area of life that requires some nuance and patience, that requires us understanding the complexity of some of these decisions that we're holding. And that it's less about, was this the right or wrong thing? It could be more about, is this inviting me to draw nearer to God and people, or to draw further from God and people? And that's not a clear-cut way of seeing things right away. Discernment is a way of seeing and knowing. It's a way of moving into alignment with your newest self, truest self, and God. It's about aligning what I believe are my core values on the inside with the common good around me. And it's asking and holding the question with integrity of, what is my role in bringing the peace of God into the world around me? And how might that look for me today in my own life, in my own family and community, and the greater world at large? And so I don't know that I have a simple definition of discernment, but I think maybe if this is a newer conversation to someone, you can start to understand that, discernment might take time, and it might be frustratingly unclear for a while. But I do think it's something that is definitely required for us right now, especially when we're talking about civic conversations and civic duty, and also rights and privilege.
In the Next Right Thing book, you write, in the context of discernment, that desire often lives right next door to grief. Access the grief, and you wake up the longing. Can you tell me about the role of grief in discernment? We don't love facing our grief. It's painful. Sometimes we can't avoid it, and we certainly don't want to face it on purpose. But I do think that maybe it was Brené Brown who talked about, when we dull the difficult emotions or the harder things to face, we also dull the beauty and the celebration and the joy. It's really difficult to just access one in isolation of the others. To live a wholehearted life, it means that we get it all. Parker Palmer talks about different ways our hearts can break. And he says there are two options. When suffering or difficulty or grief breaks our hearts, it could break in the direction of breaking into a million pieces and being shattered all the way. It explodes. It almost can behave almost like a grenade, like our hearts break all the way apart. But there is another option, that when suffering comes, either ours or that of those around us, our hearts could also break open, allowing for expansion and generosity, and for more love and more forgiveness, dare I say, to enter in. I think about that a lot when it comes to grief and sorrow, because there are so many times when things that we see in the headlines or in the news they're almost overwhelming to the point of freezing us up. But I think paying attention to and allowing ourselves to, first of all, name what it is that breaks our hearts, and then to allow our hearts to lead us, not
in the direction of falling all the way apart, but in breaking all the way open and asking God, what is just one next right thing I can do in the direction of peace and hope and love for the flourishing of those around me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea of our hearts breaking open, I come back to that a lot when I read the news. And especially when I read the news and my impulse is to turn it off because I don't want to see it, right? When it hurts too much. Because I'm afraid of that ricocheting out, the breaking apart. But I think to come back to Parker Palmer's words of opening, if I can return to that, being like, okay, God, let my heart open up. And I loved the way that you framed it, which is to just my next thing. Open it up just a little bit so I can figure out how I can lean in. So as you mentioned, discernment is hard. It takes work. It takes patience. It takes being willing to be in that gray zone, as you were talking about. And that's true, I think, even in the most ideal situations. But especially, I think it's hard when you're in a more difficult environment, which is what I would say a lot of our politics is, right? There's a lot of really loud voices in the political sphere, some of them tinged with hate and anger and fear, sometimes a lot of judgment. How do we discern what's right when there's that level of cacophony around us?
Well, first, I think it's important to be developing habits of discernment on the daily when things are quieter, when there aren't huge moments of crisis or hotbed topics happening around you, to have those daily practices that ground you so that when big moments of discernment come, your soul has a muscle memory and can respond in a way that is in alignment with what you have come to believe is in harmony with the heart of God. Hopefully, we are becoming people on the regular who are people who are bearing fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, and that we can make decisions about not just our own lives, but also about those who we choose to represent us in elected office, who will also reflect those in the best way that is possible with the format that we have.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to differentiate between our own beliefs and our own conviction. Sharon McMahon, America's government teacher, says this really well. She talks about the importance of asking the question, how might we develop policy that can reflect those beliefs without trying to manage or politicize our own beliefs in the lives of other people? Because we are living together in this world and trying to create this society, this experimental democratic society, based on a lot of different beliefs, a lot of different set of personal convictions. And so how can we come up with, together, from all these different spaces and ways of seeing the world, policy that will protect the most vulnerable, that will reflect things that we collectively believe are good and right and beautiful? Sometimes it's easy to think huge, but I think sometimes it's important to think smaller and at the community level, at the local level, and to allow ourselves to do that. And then I'll also say, like you said, sometimes there's this is true for me too, there's a tendency to want to shut it out and just be like, I won't. And I think there's actually time for that. I think it's important to take moments of rest so that we can be in it for the long haul. But to pay attention in those moments when we are paying attention to the cacophonous voices, what frustrates me uniquely? What, when I hear it, gets under my skin to such a degree that it gets me hot and bothered? And then paying attention to, okay, this frustrates me, and maybe turning that over and saying, okay, but where do I see the hope? Where is the direction that I can move with my unique voice and position and relationships and agency to move the needle in the direction of hope? Because any relevant change that any of us have ever made has probably, and maybe I would say, could I say 100% of the time? I don't know. But I believe it almost always begins with something that frustrates us. The reason we take action is because we're first bothered. So if we become people who muffle our own frustration, I believe we're also becoming people who are blocking our own way toward finding creative solutions to hope.
In your recent episodes of The Next Right Thing, you've been doing a series on silence and solitude. Can you talk a little bit about the role of silence and solitude in discernment?
I've learned a lot about silence from the Quakers. We've worshiped with a small Quaker community local to our town the last couple of years. I did not grow up Quaker. It's not my tradition from when I was younger, but I have been so grateful to learn how to sit in a room full of people in silence, but all facing in the same direction, all with our hearts and minds and spirits open to God and the movement of God. And this is one place where I've discovered even more than I already had learned, just the true inefficiency of the way that God's done it. If I were in charge, if I were divine, I feel like I would be faster, but God is uninterested in my pace, right? The process of discernment requires silence because silence is really a way to sort of declutter on the inside. I've said this for years that silence, stillness, and solitude are the way of decluttering the soul on the inside in the same way that spring cleaning is the way we declutter on the outside. Eugene Peterson talks about how sometimes we just have to wait for our souls to catch up to our bodies, and there's really nothing we can do but just be still. And just that alone of kind of getting our bodies and our minds and our spirits all in the same room, it takes time. And it takes an intentional practice of quieting ourselves on the outside in silence so that inner chatter it probably won't ever completely silent, at least mine isn't, but I think it can at least slow down for us to begin to hear maybe those deepest desires that we have, and maybe perhaps even the ways God might be moving within us.
When you were talking about discernment earlier, you also talked about sometimes discernment needs to happen as part of a community, which seems the opposite of solitude, right? Like we need community and we need solitude. So can you talk a little bit about why both are needed? It can't just be us going away and being quiet. There's more to it than just the moments of silence and solitude.
Well, again, I think the Quaker community has taught me this. My own natural tendency is to pull away. I have a little bit more of a withdrawn stance in just my life. It's like, oh, I have a decision to make. I'll see you later. Some people have a more natural tendency to lean in, and they will ask advice from everyone around them before they even consider tending to what might be happening on the inside of them. And so we need both. The Quakers have a practice they call a clearness committee, where they literally have a person who has a decision to make, who gets to share their case and share what's going on. And then they will communally come around that person and ask questions for clarity, and they will hold silence together, and they will not rush the process. Even their business meetings can take many, many hours because they don't want to make a call until they're all in consensus. Even if they don't all agree, they agree to disagree for the sake of the community. We know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know, and sometimes we need one another to mirror that back to us. And so I think for anyone whose natural tendency is to withdraw, it can be helpful to remember, I need people around me to show me what I don't know and to tell me their stories and their perspectives, because it's not my fault that I don't know, but it is if I don't ask and I'm not willing to hear and listen. And then I would say for those who tend to always go to other people first, that I would say that there is a real beauty in learning to trust yourself and your own voice, not to the exclusion of everyone else's, but that you also have a voice at the table, and it's one that needs to be heard and paid attention to. And sometimes the only way to know what it is you deeply desire or what deeply matters to you is to just shut all the way up for a little bit, to sit down on the inside and to tend to those inner stirrings. I also recognize, P.S., that this can be deeply uncomfortable for a lot of us. And so I would just say, hold a lot of compassion toward yourself as you practice stillness or silence or solitude or some of these more quiet practices, whether it's alone or with a community, to just have buckets of compassion available for you, because just like any other practice, it is a practice, which implies intention and direction, but not perfection. Intention and direction, but not perfection.
One of the commitments of the project is treating politics as practice. And I think thinking about politics as commitment and direction, but not perfection, both for ourselves as we try and figure out how to be citizens, but also for others as they're trying to figure out how to be citizens. I think that creates space for a lot more grace. And like you say, compassion for ourselves and others, which is sorely needed. All right, so I want to dive into the new book. To start us off, can you tell us about the guiding analogy for the book? Because we'll use that analogy kind of the rest of the conversation. And so just want to introduce listeners who haven't read the book yet to that analogy.
Well, it's all about the art of discerning and knowing when to stay and when to walk away, and stay where. That depends. If I think about our lives, sometimes it's helpful to think in terms of metaphor. I can't help it. The metaphor that I have been living with for several years is this idea of how our lives are like a house. And every room of that house tells a story. And every room represents different commitments and communities and places. And some of those rooms are rooms that we were born into, our families, our church communities, some ideologies, and they feel quite comfortable. And we feel at home there, and we know the layout of those rooms, and we love them. Other rooms, we might stick our heads in, trying different things. But as soon as we get in there, we're like, this is not my room, and I'm going to walk on out. And those are the easy ones. But I think that sometimes we need some help, some frameworks, some discernment for those times when a room that maybe we have grown quite comfortable in or has been deeply beloved to us or familiar, when we're in one of those types of rooms and we begin to see some cracks in the foundation, or we begin to sense that something has shifted or changed, whether in the room around us or something has shifted and changed within us. And what do we do when a room where we belong is maybe a room that's no longer for us? How do we discern if that's just us being weirdos or being, ill content, or if there's an invitation to something new, whether to make a change in the room that we're in, or actually if it's time for us to say goodbye and walk away. Part of a healthy human rhythm of our lives is leaving rooms and finding new ones. But I think that oftentimes we are afraid to ask ourselves some of these really important questions about the rooms we're in, because maybe this is a place we prayed for, or a place that we wanted for a really long time. This is something that we went to school for and paid a lot of money for, and here I am questioning it. How could I? But I think those things tend to put a cap or a limit on us in ways that I don't believe God ever intended, that some things are right for a time. And then it's also right to consider if that time has come to an end. Most things end. And the question is, how can we face our endings with courage, with grace and compassion, with honesty, without the binary of either just staying in something long past time and staying quiet, or burning bridges and raising hell on the way out? Is there a third way? I believe there is. And that's what I tried to write into in this book, How to Walk into a Room.
It's so beautiful. And as I mentioned in my intro, it's an analogy that's really spacious because those rooms can be so many different things. And so I feel like it's one I'm going to come back to in many different seasons of life for many different things. Okay, so I want to talk about leaving a space or deciding whether to leave. There are political rooms that many of us inhabit. Parties, probably the most obvious one, but there's others as well. It could be ideological, it could be advocacy groups, it could be just the way we imagine ourselves as citizen. And I think the last few years have left many people feeling uneasy in those rooms. So what do you do when you begin to feel uncomfortable in a room that you've been in for a long time?
I think it's important to start with a practice that I've borrowed from other places, but it's called point and call. And this comes from the Japanese railway system that initiated this safety system of pointing and calling, where literally the conductor will point to various parts of the train or what's happening on the platform, and they will call it out loud. If the signal's green, they point to the signal and call it out. Signal is green. They point to the clock at the time of departure and call it out loud. And it seems like, what's the point? Well, the point is safety. And actually it worked. That workplace errors were reduced by up to 85%. James Clear talks about this in his book, Atomic Habits, as a way of building habits in our lives, in our daily lives. And I use it here as a practice of discernment, because in a moment where you're not sure what to do, especially as things are shifting, or you find yourself frustrated, or you look around at the landscape where you've been all your life and it started to change, either because the landscape is different or your eyes are different, you're seeing different. A really accessible first step is to simply point and call what is true in this space where I am right now. Who is here? What is good and beautiful here? There's always something good and beautiful. Point it out, call it out loud. That will help you if you end up deciding to walk away from it, because it will help you do it more honestly. It's easier to walk away from something when everything's terrible, but usually everything is not terrible. So be honest about what's good and beautiful and also what might be terrible. I think noticing who is in this room with me, whether that's a political party or a ideology or a faith community, whatever it is, but also notice who has already walked out of this room and who has the power in this room and how do they wield their power and what are they willing to do to keep their power? Are you the one with the power in the room? And how are you wielding your own power? And so there's a series of questions we can ask that are not necessarily diagnostic. They're just informational. And if we can start there and pay attention to what are these days filled with, what is happening here when I turn the lights on in this room? What is true about it? What can I, as best as I can, objectively observe what is true in this space? And I think that's a really important first movement in discernment. So if we are in one of these spaces and we go through that pointing and calling exercise, and as we listen, we feel that it's time to leave, it's time to go. Sometimes when we leave spaces, it can feel like we're walking into nothingness, but we're not, right? And in the political realm, and I think especially in terms of party politics, I know many people who've left their party or just stepping back for a bit, but they don't feel welcomed or ready to join the other party. And we have a two-party system, so that becomes a little bit tricky. And so they're stuck in this in-between. Can you talk about how we navigate liminal spaces or the hallways in your house analogy? First, I'll say a party will never be for us everything we hope it will be. I think in a two-party system, like you said, it's not a perfect system, but it's the one we've got right now. And so recognizing that changing our expectations of how at home we will feel anywhere, we were never meant to find our home in our political parties. And so there will always be disappointment there. So just, I think, pointing and calling that out loud and recognizing there are imperfections here. That's really important. You mentioned that we're not necessarily walking into nothing, but it can feel like we're walking into nothing. When you think of a house, we might focus on the rooms, but the reality is the hallway is a place too. It is not a nothing place. It is an important place. Sometimes it can feel like a waiting room. Sometimes it feels like a bridge. Sometimes there are hallways that we set up camp in and are in for a very long time. And I think that we often have this sense that if I'm in a hallway, I must rush and find a room quickly because you can't live in a hallway. And I would maybe push back a bit on that and say, oh, dear friend, there are hallways many of us live in for a very long time. We can be in a hallway for decades. And when I say hallway, I mean this space of where we're holding a question or we don't know what to do next. We don't know where to put up our bed. We don't know where to put up the sofa because we feel like we don't really belong in any of these rooms that are along the path of this hallway. But a hallway is a space. It is a true place. It may not feel comfortable. We mentioned Parker Palmer earlier, and I think he is someone who has encouraged me to be willing to hold the tension a little bit longer rather than rushing to a solution that might not be for the betterment of all. And it's just like cognitive dissonance. It's just like an unmade decision. Same goes for tension. We don't like to hold that space because it's uncomfortable. But if we can develop practices that help us find inner peace in the midst of external chaos, that is a practice for a mature person who's able to abide these dissonant realities and these imperfect solutions, but to be able to hold them without just rushing to one and saying, this one solves all of my answers, and therefore I'm going to make myself blind to all of its problems. This is where discernment is important, is because we need to be able to discern not just dark from light, but also gradients of gray in between. And sometimes the only place we can do that from is not from the center of a room, but it's in a hallway where we can peek into two different doorways and see the good and the beautiful there, the good and the beautiful there, the terrible over there. And then where can we do our best next right thing with the information that we have now, knowing that we have a voice, but we are not the only ones responsible. We are not singularly responsible for this, but we are responsible to contribute. And we just have to find ways to do that in the best ways that we can with what we know for now.
One of the things that really speaks to me in that is this idea of the hallways as a place where we hold our questions. It reminds me of some of Krista Tippett's work on living into our questions, right? That the questions aren't things that we answer necessarily. They're things that we explore to be in these liminal spaces of here's what I'm still asking myself about who I am as a citizen, about who I want our country to be, about how we get there, and to not rush the answers, but to be mindful that just holding that question and noticing, like you said, peeking into the different places is in and of itself this really beautiful, worthy thing to be doing, and that it's okay to just hold that. We don't have to have answers right away. So we talked about evaluating whether the room that you're in is one that you should stay in or not, what it feels like to be in these hallways and how we navigate those spaces. What about when you decide to stay in a room? You've looked at it, it's not perfect, but you decided for now, this is where you are supposed to stay. How do we stay with authenticity and integrity after we've done this evaluation and honestly done the pointing and calling that points out the beauty, but also the hard parts of rooms?
It's important to continue that practice of when you stay in a space to not, in order to make yourself feel okay being here, to not turn a blind eye to what may be harmful in that space. I'll share a really concrete example that's not necessarily political, but it happened in my own life where we decided and discerned that it was time for us to leave our faith community. And it would have been easier to leave if I could have disparaged the entire place and everyone in it. That would have been easier, but it wouldn't have been honest. And I also look at the people who I love and respect who decided to stay. And probably for them, it would have been easier for them to walk away with me so that they could not have to wrestle with some of the things that they have to hold in tension by remaining there. And so I think that's an important practice to continue, not just in the decision-making process, but even after you have decided, okay, I'm going to stay in this place, but I'm not going to ignore the things here that are problematic, and I'm going to do what I can to be an agent of change to the best that I can. Not every space is healthy or safe for all of us to do that in. That's where discernment comes in, personal discernment for your own life about knowing what do I have the capacity to hold, because inviting someone to hold the tension longer when they're someone who has been through trauma or heartbreak in a particular way, in a particular space, that's an unkind and maybe even an unsafe practice for them to just hold the tension longer. No, you probably need to get out of there. But for those who can and who really sense an invitation to stay in a space that maybe they love and feel called to do it with integrity means being able to see all that it is and not just all that you wished that it was or all that it used to be. And then also to have a vision for what it could be and to maybe be someone who's able to bring that forth. I think that's a really important part of staying in spaces with integrity. And I would also say continuing to ask yourself whether your space is a metaphorical, like an ideological space, or if it's a physical, true, actually concrete community, of asking questions like, who has a voice here and what are they saying? How generous are they to voices that are different from theirs? How willing are they to hear the voices of those in the margins? What role do the marginalized have in this space? Are we willing to listen to their stories? David Gushee talks about how the people who probably have the best idea of what's actually going on are those who are in the margins. They have a fuller picture of the whole thing rather than those who are maybe at the top or in the spotlight. So those are some questions that I think are important to ask no matter what space we're in.
And it's interesting because you point to that staying can be hard, right? But leaving it can also be hard, and entering in new spaces can be really hard and scary too. Can you talk a little bit about when you feel ready to enter into a new space? How do we do that? How do we enter well?
My friend Dr. Natasha Sistrunk Robinson says there are some rooms you can't go into to find out who you are. You have to know who you are when you get there. And so when it's time to walk into a room, it's so important that we know what it is to lead ourselves first. I think we are all leaders. We don't have to be in charge in order to be a leader. In fact, some of the best leaders are the ones who aren't in charge. So when we are walking into rooms that we have been invited into, or whether we're walking into the same room we've been in, but we're wanting to walk in a different way, leading yourself first is such an important practice. And that includes finding those spiritual practices and rhythms that feed your soul, that bring your inner life into alignment with your outer life. It's being honest about the room that you're in so that you are not turning a blind eye to the parts that are difficult or uncomfortable. It's being someone who is not just trying to please people, but is recognizing what it might look like to lead people by sometimes saying uncomfortable things or leaning in when you would so much rather lean all the way out. These are just some small things to think about when we consider walking into rooms like a leader, even when we're not the one in charge. I think it's also important to walk in as our own friend. Sometimes we look around the room and we think, who here can I link arms with for this cause? Or who will agree with me? Where can I find my voice repeated and echoed, and so that I can feel really good about what it is that I believe, or the decisions that I'm making, or the ways that I'm voting? But I think first, part of leading ourselves is being our own friend and remembering that this is what I've discerned, and this is where I believe God is leading, what I believe is best for the greater good, and paying attention to and coming alongside yourself with compassion, both for those times when you need to lean in, as well as those times when you might need to bow out for a moment and to regroup and to take a break. That is something that sometimes I think we can feel a little guilty for, that, oh, I don't want to disengage because it's such a privilege to disengage. But sometimes it's important to not disengage, but to maybe take a rest, take a break for the benefit of the long haul.
Yeah. Well, for our last question, I want to pivot back to the goal of this podcast, which is to empower people to engage politically from a place of hope. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're engaging this election season and where you find hope?
I mentioned Sharon McMahon earlier, and I think she's such a great example of moving in the direction of hope, despite all of the voices of despair that we hear. And there are not just voices of despair in a dramatic way, but there's true despair surrounding us. People are hurting and wars are happening, and this is all true. What is also true is that we are not nothing and we are not helpless. I think about Mr. Rogers telling the story of his mother, who said when he was very young and told him that when bad things happen, look for the helpers, and paying attention to there are always helpers doing something. But I'd like to point out that was the advice of a mother to her young son. And I think it's interesting how we as grown-ups often take comfort in those words, like, oh yes, I'm going to look for the helpers. But we're actually the grown-ups now. We are the helpers now. And so we are Mr. Rogers' mother. We are not the 4-year-old waiting for the helpers to show up, that we are actually the helpers now. And so paying attention to, okay, what does that look like today in my own community? Not necessarily in the whole wide world. If we all paid attention to what bothers me, where is my heart breaking open, and what is one next right thing I can do today in the direction of hope, and then again tomorrow, I think those are ways that we can engage politically in our own communities and our own unique personalities that can really make a big difference in the world.
Thank you so much for being here with me today. I was wondering if you could close us off with your Be Here blessing, which to all the listeners alongside her book She offers, through the Quiet Collection app, blessings for hellos and goodbyes. I use them as walking meditations. So I go on a walk and I listen to them. The Be Here one captures so much complexity. And so if you could end us with sharing that blessing.
I would love to. This is a blessing for being here. Blessed are you, the one who is here. It may not be the here you want or the here you had before, but here you are anyway. Right now you with how you feel and what you're doing and all the things you hold. Hello to what you want. Peace, dinner, more money, a cookie, forgiveness, healing, a better pair of pants. Hello to the things you want that are easy to point to and call out, and also the things you're slow to name. Hello to what you miss. Love, his laugh, her silliness, a good night's sleep, a predictable schedule, their support, your favorite show, the way things were. Hello to the things you miss that are easy to point to and call out, and also the things you're slow to name. Hello to what you hope for. Closure, resolution, justice to be served, clarity, connection, the last piece of pie. Hello to the things you hope for, that are easy to point to and call out, and also the things you're slow to name. Hello to the light of now, of the morning as a new day begins, of the candle on the dining room table, of the hope for a new thing beginning, of the knowledge of a good thing ending, of the divine light of God in everyone around you. Hello to you, to what you want, to what you miss, to what you hope for. Blessed are you as you stay in this moment and you tell the whole truth about what you see. Here's to the rooms you inhabit today. May you have the integrity to be honest, the tenacity to speak up, the fortitude to stay, and the insight to know when it's time to walk away.
At this election, we see politics as practice, and each conversation is paired with a practice that you can take with you as you heal from and engage the political arena. Emily has a few offerings for us this election season. First, the blessing you just heard is offered as a standalone meditation that you can come back to at any time. It's available on our Spiritual Practices website and our YouTube channel. But the best place to listen to it is through Emily's Quiet Collection app. Through the app, Emily offers prayers, blessings, and meditations set to gentle piano music. One of the collections, Blessings for Hellos and Goodbyes, was developed specifically to accompany you through life's various endings and beginnings. It and the other collections are a beautiful way to enter into spaces of discernment. The app is free, as are her collections of borrowed prayers and psalms. The Blessings for Hellos and Goodbyes come with her new book, or you can purchase it as a standalone collection. Her second offering is a free decision-making guide that can help you move through decisions with a bit more space and wisdom. Use it for any decision, including the political ones you face this season. Finally, her book, How to Walk into a Room. There is so much wisdom packed into 218 pages. There are questions to ask if you are considering leaving a room, practices to engage in to prepare your heart to discern your next right thing, and so much more. Grab it and the free collection of blessings that come with it. I'll include links to all of these offerings in our show notes. There are also links to these offerings and the offerings from all of our guests, including a 30-day subscription to the class, at our Spiritual Practices webpage at www.thiselection.org/spiritualpractices. You have been listening to This Election, where we explore the inner work that is needed to do politics differently. Today we heard from Emily P Freeman. You can find her on the Next Right Thing podcast, on Substack at The Soul Minimalist, on her website at www.emilypfreeman.com, and on Instagram, Facebook, and X at Emily P Freeman. I'm your host, Katie Cochran, and I would love to hear from you. You can email me at katie@thiselection.org or message me on Instagram at katie.m.cochran. If you have enjoyed this conversation, I have a favor to ask. I believe there are people like you and me who need to hear the wisdom of our guests and to feel the hope that comes from the fact that others are with them on this journey to do politics differently. You can help us reach those people by doing 3 things. First, subscribing to the podcast. Second, rating and reviewing the podcast. And third, sharing it with a friend. Before closing, I want to thank the people who made this show possible. Ian Cochran wrote and performed the piano music you hear at the beginning and end of our show. Dave Cochran helped him with production. My dear friend Kristen Connolly painted the podcast artwork. It, along with other beautiful pieces, are available for purchase at her Art for All shop on www.love-kristen.com. Finally, I want to thank you for being willing to go on this journey with me and for the work you are doing discerning your next right thing in life and politics. It makes a difference, and I am so grateful.